Right now, onto this. Placing Eubank under curatorship by the South African Reserve Bank yesterday has brought into sharp focus the quality of accounting and auditing in South Africa's financial services sector. The microlender is managed by trustees elected by some mine workers, trade unions and the Minerals Council of South Africa. Reserve Bank Governor Lesija Kganyago revealed that Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana had appointed KPMG South Africa as the curator out of concern for Eubank's corporate governance, internal control weaknesses, and a lack of sufficient capital to ensure its viability. Joining us now to outline the fiduciary role of the accounting and auditing professions are Linda Maqoba, President and Board Chairperson of the Association for the Advancement of Black Accountants of Southern Africa, Accountant and Academic Kasi Tole, and Thando Myoli, Project Director of Assurance at the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants. Now let's take you back into history a little bit to look at the financial institution in South Africa and some of the challenges that they have undergone. Back in 2014, the African Bank was placed under curatorship, which in 2022, the SARB tells us that they have now emerged from curatorship. SARB saying that they can't secure buyer for the 50 stake of this particular bank. In 2018, if you will remember, VBS Bank collapsed after the great bank heist. In 2020, municipalities submitting claims totaling 1.5 billion rands. And then in 2022, here we are today, Eubank placed under curatorship. The SARB saying the bank has a capital adequacy rate of 3% as opposed to the mandated 20%. How serious is the issue facing Eubank? That's where we begin. Good evening to you, and thank you very much for joining us. Linda, let's start with you. How serious is the situation facing the bank, especially considering that the Reserve Bank says, well, what we are looking at here is a possibility or a risk that in the future you might not be able to meet your obligations. Yet in the same vein, they are saying, no, go ahead, remain open, and people must still deposit their money. I mean, how serious is this Eubank's capital adequacy ratio versus the liquidity ratio situation?
Thank you, Thabo. Thank you for having us on the show to weigh in as a BASA, and good evening to your viewers. I think the first reaction you would have as someone, I think from my side, would be to actually look at the financials that you can actually get on the website of Eubank. And when we talk about these terminologies, for me, my concern is what is the layman thinking? All they're thinking is my money is in this bank, and you're telling me that there's a curatorship, and I'm having flashbacks of something that's happened before, of a bank that has collapsed in this manner. So you're quite right that the balance of do we panic, do we not panic? But I think with putting in the curator, it's much the same as what happened with VBS, that the curator does need to investigate and see what is actually going on here. And we must give it that time. So in terms of the seriousness, there are people being appointed by the Prudential Authority to the decision with the Finance Ministry around, and Prudential, for me, it's about the prudence as well to say, look, let's make sure we put something in place to protect the depositors. But I would err away from saying how serious is it now, because that is the role of our curator to also investigate the extent of this and also give feedback to the depositors and to the country.
As a good evening to Kai as well, joining us from over the seas. Jobe, corporate governance concerns cited by the governor, high number of internal control weaknesses, and prolonged periods it has taken for the bank to be able to inject sufficient cash to be able to address the capital issues. How serious are these things, and what do they actually mean? I mean, what are the corporate governance issues that are so serious that the Reserve Bank would be advised to say, no, this bank must go under curatorship?
Good evening, and good evening to the viewers. The essence of the issues that have been raised by the Reserve Bank governor relating to the governance in particular are remarkably serious. Banks are very unique institutions in that they aren't just institutions that matter only to the people that have deposited in them or those that may be working for them. Any fear or any instability in the bank, in any bank, has the risk of actually escalating the risk factors across the entire banking system. So when you refer to the stability of the entire banking system, it becomes important that all its role players are actually kept running efficiently, and as soon as one starts misbehaving or one starts being managed in a manner that leaves a lot of red flags, it is the responsibility of the Reserve Bank and the Prudential Authority to ask the question of whether that single institution may be a reflection of things to come. So that step is quite unique. Most other sectors and organizations do not have that same level of oversight. Every institution is seen as a single player, but the banking system is regarded as interconnected. When you look at the Eubank state of affairs, there has been some serious instability in relation to executive leadership. And of course, when there is no executive leadership, it becomes important to ask the question of, well, who is actually running the strategy of the institution, who is ensuring that the institution remains viable within the parameters set by the Reserve Bank. And clearly, in relation to Eubank, there's been concerns that have been raised for a very long time. And I think even last year, the Reserve Bank had already started engaging the bank and asking questions around its soundness, and clearly those questions remain unresolved, and that's why a curator has been put in place.
Yeah. Thando, I mean, while at that particular point, it seems there is maybe not as much of a clear understanding from the shareholders' point of view as to what it actually meant that you've got enough capital to ensure that you will meet your future obligations. Because they say, well, look, we had a last-minute meeting. We showed them that there's 800 million coming in. So what the fuss? We are shocked. Why are we now going into curatorship? I mean, is that the understanding that, look, if I've shown you today that tomorrow there'll be 800 million, then we should be okay?
Good evening, Pablo. Good evening to all of you viewers as well as my fellow panelists. Yes, I think Kai has kind of highlighted the importance of the issue. If you actually go back and look at the financial statements of Eubank in the past years, something that the auditors have consistently raised as well. The auditors being SNG, GT, Grant Thornton, something that they raised in last year. If I look at the 2021 financials as well, the issue of the capital adequacy requirements. So I mean, I think enough time has been given to those in governance to actually remedy the issue. And what the SARB have seen is that there has not been much progress that has been made. And it's important to highlight the fact that whenever corporate failures happen, we always raise the issue of why did the regulators not act in time, why did the auditors not act in time, etc. I think what we're seeing here is the case of the regulator actually being prudent and making sure that they're acting on time to prevent any future collapse happening at the bank. I mean, I think Linda had already mentioned that the issue of the capital adequacy requirements does not necessarily mean that the bank is actually failing to cover rand for rand when you look at the depositors' amounts that they put into the bank. But we've got a regulation there for a reason, to protect the public at large, to protect the investors, to make sure that in the case of any unexpected event that takes place, they do have the adequate protection. So I think it's very important that we do give, I guess, that the Reserve Bank, the space that they need to actually follow through with this decision.
All right, let's take a break. When we continue next, we look at the profession itself. The fact that currently Eubank is the only commercial bank, in my understanding, and I think that's what the Reserve Bank governor said, that is under curatorship. Is that a good thing? Does that bode well? And as far as the profession is concerned, of those who are exercising oversight over our financial institutions, we'll get reaction to that in a moment's time. We're back with you tonight here on In Focus. The placing of Eubank under curatorship. What does that say about the state of accounting and auditing firms? Also, what does it say about the state of governance and oversight at our financial institutions? Considering that, as I place the timeline there, we've had 3 banks at least in the last decade that have gone through some of the challenges that have got to do with the liquidity of the banks. Linda, let's come back to you. I mean, Thando's already said that the auditors had flagged this issue, which means, I suppose to an extent, they were doing what they were supposed to have been doing. There is a board in place. So, I mean, without placing too much blame on anybody, where do you think the telephone line actually broke here and led to this point where there is now curatorship?
Thabo, I think, the governor does even mention it in his statement, that management is charged with the stewardship of running the affairs of the bank. And we've also seen, if you look at the financials, you'll see a CEO has resigned, and those things can filter down, and those are things I don't really want us to, we can comment on them, but we need to look at what is the impact going down. But management is tasked with making sure that they respond to some of the things that the auditors are raising. So there's also the split and understanding, and I think we must go into that as well, of the difference between the statutory audit and the regulatory audit. So that's where the liquidity and the going concern in the statutory audit is showing that the auditors are seeing it as a going concern, the bank. But because of the requirements to create the buffer, that is where management is falling a bit short. And they must deal with that because the differential to get to the 20% is quite huge. So that needs to be investigated. We need to have some sort of remedying that's going to happen there. And the capital injection, the question that Num is asking, needs to be answered in that how are we going to make sure that we get investment into the bank that they can match and respond to the declining ratio, capital adequacy ratio. So management, I think, is at the center of this as well. And the board, in terms of its oversight role, does also play a role.
Talk to me to somebody who does not understand. 98% of the deposits there are retail depositors. So people are putting their money in there. You've got the bank having assets totaling 5.2 billion rands. Is that a good thing? And where do you go to look for investment? At what point do you decide, now we're going to look for this investment?
I think in this case, Thabo, Numa said that they found an investor. It's quite interesting to where they're going to, this 800 million that was mentioned. But the bank has that role to run that and find the solutions around the capital injection. In terms of the retailers and the deposits that are coming in, it's also the appetite around this particular space from a Eubank. And management must make that balance and juggle that to be able to respond to this. So it's just a case of where do we go from here? And my biggest concern is the real people on the ground, which are the depositors that are putting their hard-earned money, and we're linking to the masses in terms of the mining industry as well, and the miners. I'm more concerned about that space, and in terms of people concerned about their hard-earned cash, never mind the big investment that is coming from retailers and those sorts of investors. It is the layman on the street around what is the responsibility that management now has here to make sure that they comply with the regulatory requirements. But I do want to go back, Thabo, to say, let's not just be careful that as we're talking about the compliance from a regulatory space, we are still looking at what the auditor is saying in terms of the liquidity and the role that the curator now does have to inform and educate the depositors and the people that could lose their hard-earned money here around this particular situation.
So whether we can get what you're saying, there's still a possibility of people, depositors losing their money? The governor saying liquidity coverage ratio is in excess of the regulatory requirement if you look at the total assets of 5.2 billion rand. So are you saying the people, the retail depositors, even with that, should still be worried?
So I don't want to comment too much on that, Thabo, in that I'm more responding around what is the risk of the people that would probably have thinking around, is this a repeat of a VBS? And how do we respond to that and make sure that there's not too much alarm, and how do we balance and how to respond to them for them to understand the difference between the liquidity, which is your ability to actually pay your liabilities within the next 12 months. And we are still having a bank that's still operating. And that are the remarks that I think we must also look at from the governor and his statement.
Kaya, when you look at those numbers and compared to VBS, right, at some point people who had deposited 100,000, I think they were only promised to get back 10,000, if I'm correct. My numbers could be wrong here. But if they are saying, no, the bank has got assets of 5.2 billion, is that comfort for a depositor to say, oh, well, if things go past here, if I deposited 100,000, I'll get it back?
Yeah, there are huge differences between this case and VBS. At VBS, the money was stolen, so there was nothing left, and then the state had to step in and figure out how to cover those deposits. The key distinction here is that the reason the Reserve Bank governor says that people may still transact with the bank is that there are essentially two pots that we have to look into. The first pot is a question of whether those that have deposited money into the bank are able to withdraw it as and when they want. And that talks about the liquidity of the bank, and at this stage there is sufficient liquidity. In other words, anyone who's ever deposited money into Eubank, if they wanted it tomorrow, they'll be able to get it. The secondary problem that seems to have emerged is that a bank is then required to have a bit more in the pot than the sum of what it owes you and I. And of course, you have to understand that it doesn't just work on receiving and transacting deposits. It also has to run its operations. So if the bank only had my deposits and had the responsibility to pay it, it simply wouldn't be able to run its operations. So it's the second pot of money, which is where we talk about the capital adequacy, where we then say, well, even if you had to pay all the deposits that are due tomorrow, would you still be able to run the operations? And that's where there is indeed a gap. The problem that I have, unfortunately, which is a departure from what a lot of people have been saying, is that I do think that the Reserve Bank has been too slow in dealing with this matter, because as far back as June last year, it was clearly stated by the auditors and by the bank itself that it needed an amount of at least 250 million rand, and that amount was due to have been received by June last year. So we can imagine that if they haven't been able to meet, which is a core requirement, the capital requirements are indeed a law. If they haven't been able to meet that since June last year, all the way up to May this year, I have to ask serious questions about why the Reserve Bank would have allowed this to persist so far, whether they kept believing that the bank was going to be able to raise the amount of money, and if this was regarded as an urgent matter and as a critical matter, why exactly has it taken so long? So the statement from Noom that says that, oh, we finally found 800 billion rand overnight is not particularly relevant in this case. The question is, why did there have to be a regulator in the room in the first place for you to sort out your recapitalization? Because the rules have been designed in order to ensure that the regulator never has to step in. And the fact that the regulator has been invited into the room indicates that those responsible for running this institution have not been fit to task.
Yeah. Tanda, the fact that, and you correct me here, this could possibly be the only commercial bank currently that is under curatorship, does that bode well? Does that mean those who are supposed to do what they need to do are doing what they're supposed to do? We know in VBS that, for example, auditors did not do what they are supposed to do. That's why some of them were fired, some of them are in trouble as we speak right now. Is that the situation across the board, or do you find that generally auditors are actually good at what they do?
I guess in any profession, you'll always get a few bad apples. But I think, if you look at the number of auditors that we have that are actually undergoing disciplinary cases, etc., it's very few. It's very few compared to the entire population of auditors. That being said, there is a role that the public expects the audit profession to play. And it's very important that the profession plays that role effectively. Otherwise, that's why we kind of see a lot of the trust issues that have emanated over the past few years. So the profession, really, the auditing profession needs to step up. We always talk about the audit expectation gap, which is the gap between what the public expects versus what the auditors actually do. And I think we really need to have some frank discussions in terms of what the public expects the auditor to do. But that also being said, we also just need to remember that the profession itself does not really exist in a silo. It's part of a financial reporting ecosystem where you get your preparers of financial information, where you get those who sit on on governance structures. So I think when those bad cases do happen, it's very important that we send a strong message to the entire ecosystem and not just pull out the auditors on their own. So I think really in this case, we cannot really say that the auditors have been negligent in their job. A lot still needs to come out in terms of the work that the curator will be performing. But it's still my strong view that that the Reserve Bank is being prudent, and they're really kind of getting the organization to stabilize as soon as possible. So that's the regulator also playing their part.
Yeah. Linda, and I hope you can get into this one. In terms of that strong message that Tando is talking about, and the broader sense of enhancing the safety and soundness of financial institutions that play particularly in the microfinance space, because these are really minors, they don't really earn a lot of money, and so this money is really rather important. Do you think there needs to be some extra regulatory stuff put there, or more eyes at least, making sure that you watch that particular sector to ensure that at least the trust deficit is addressed?
Well, I think we can explore around what extra lens, and I mean looking at the history as well. This particular bank had one auditor, which is SMG. Our bigger banks would have two auditors as required by Prudential Authority. And maybe this is an opportunity even to say, look, the financial services sector is quite monopolized. And I think Kaya has written some pieces around some of this monopoly that happens. But maybe we can say, as we grow and try to put extra mitigating factors around an eye, how do we also put in a transformation lens around this particular space? And would an SNG need, or any audit firm that was auditing a bank such as a Eubank or this particular commercial bank, maybe need a second auditor? We can explore those sorts of things if that is really what's needed for the sake of the public interest and the people that put their money in these banks. And that's a conversation that must be had, considering the trend and the history. And like Kaya is saying, the decline has been seen, and how long has it taken us to respond to that? But I also want to say, maybe we are too hard on the auditors, like what Tutando is saying, and not to take away the responsibility of the auditors, but this is it's an ecosystem. So the people charged with making sure that when we identify these things from an audit perspective, how is management responding, and how are they making sure that they are compliant? Because compliance is very important, and SARB did what they had to do.
Let's take a break. When we continue next, what is the curator then now to do? Two things cited by the governor is decisions around the granting of loans to sound banking activities, and I suppose they are now the ones who are going to oversee this process of getting this 800 million that the bank has been waiting for. Back with you tonight, Linda Mangoma, Kaya Sitole, and Tando Myoli. With us tonight, we're discussing the question of Eubank and its curatorship and what this means for the trust in our financial institutions, especially for the many depositors in rural areas who are depositing their money in banks such as Eubank. Kaya, we are speaking of African Bank now emerging out of curatorship. Of course, there are other issues around who's going to buy a stake in that bank. We can have those conversations maybe another time. But let's talk about the role that the curator played in that bank, and now it emerging out of curatorship. And is that likely going to be the same process followed here?
Essentially, the parameters are the same, because in that case, it was PwC that stepped in as a curator. And of course, the primary responsibility of the curator is to simply establish the facts and figure out exactly what the condition or the state of the institution is. In the African Bank case, it became quite clear that there was a case to be made for splitting the bank into two parts. There was the good bank, which is the African Bank of today, and there was what was referred to as the bad bank, where far too much in the way of complexities existed, and it was seen as something that was dragging the rest of the institution down. So that was the solution solution to the African Bank case. In the case of Eubank, it's going to be the mission of the KPMG curator to actually establish whether the bank is indeed viable and what needs to be done in order to ensure that it emerges on the other side of curatorship as a stronger and a more stable institution. So hopefully that particular report will emerge sooner rather than later, but it's always a question of the resources that have been allocated and the access to information, and more importantly, the participation of the shareholders in particular, because at the end of the day, they still are the ultimate owners of the institution, and whatever the curator comes up with as recommendations or insights is something that will require the input and the insights and perhaps a concurrence of the shareholders.
What you've just said, is that the same as what I saw in one online publication, that KPMG is coming in to clean up the balance sheet of Eubank? What does cleaning up the balance sheet actually mean?
I wouldn't say that coming in to clean it up. Operation is something very different, but rather their responsibility is to simply assess and provide a report to the Reserve Bank that says this is the state of affairs of the institution. This is how we think it will take to get it back to viability. And of course, I think we can already predict the answer. The answer is that it needs to be properly capitalized. The answer will be that it needs a much stronger board of directors. And the answer will be that it needs someone who's very strong and very competent in running an institution to be the chief executive officer. So perhaps this is one of the easiest conversations we've had around the curatorship, because I can literally tell you right now what the ultimate report is going to look like.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people would say, well, I mean, from what we hear, Eubank largely black-owned, wholly black-owned, so they wouldn't want to see another black-owned banks, for example, fail. Is that on the cards? Is that a possibility?
Look, again, at the end of the day, if no one steps up and says, I'm going to put up the capital that the Reserve Bank has said is necessary in order for us to restore the capital adequacy ratio, then of course there's a possibility that the bank will simply not survive. So the first question is there someone out there willing to put up a hand and saying, I'm going to put up this capital? Will those people be able to put up the capital in the time frame that the Reserve Bank will actually give to them? And until we sort of know who those individuals are, then of course it's unclear whether they actually will be a business case to be made by whoever says, look, I've heard that there's a bank stake that is available. Maybe it's even the current shareholders are going to raise that particular capital. So that's the first question. Will anyone put up the capital? The second question, of course, is that the reason Eubank has been such a big red flag for many years is that, unfortunately, as we've been saying throughout this conversation, it has a primary reliance on a very, very fragile sector, and that is a sector relating to mining. So in any assessment, the concentration risk, which simply means that far too many of its customers have got the same profile, in other words, they work in the mining sector, right, has always created the problem that if the mining sector goes through a downside or a downturn, or it starts downsizing, then of course a core part of their customer base actually disappears. And then being a retail institution simply means that they rely on the ability of the miners to keep making deposits, and once that starts disappearing, then you actually have a bigger crisis and an irreversible trend.
Is that why the governor is saying they need to also, the curator that is, look at diversifying the bank's business model to ensure future sustainability?
The Reserve Bank didn't have to say that. It's something that's been said by absolutely anyone who has an understanding of Eubank's business model. Their business model has been really problematic for many years, and that simply means that unless they actually diversify and change their business model and make it more balanced, it may probably not make sense for anyone to put up their hands and say, I want to rescue this institution, because it's quite clear that for as long as it is so heavily reliant on one type of customers, which is the mining community, its viability is not a 10 or a 20-year project. When you look at the trends that have been happening in the mining industry, when you look at what the alternative banks and alternative financial service providers are able to offer as a service. So even if we didn't end up in curatorship, the question of the bank's long-term viability had always been clear, given the fact that for many years it quite simply has not been able to address its concentration risk.
Yeah. Thando, the curator coming in to oversee now the resolution plan, what would it take for them to successfully do that?
Number one is really cooperation with the staff that's there. So access to information, access to key staff, so that at the end of the day they are able to draft that report to the Reserve Bank. A clear direction as well from the Reserve Bank in terms of timelines, in terms of the timeframes within which they need to report. So I think it's gonna, it's going to take a bit of time. We've seen with the African Bank case that is something that it's not something that happened overnight. It did take a bit of time. But that being said as well, Kaya has kind of highlighted that some of the issues that the bank has been grappling with have been quite clear. If you look at the reports that have been issued in the past, if you look at the issues when it comes to the governance structures they bought in particular, and the turnover in the CEO position. So I think a lot of access to information, definitely access to staff to make sure that they're able to draft that report within the prescribed timelines.
Yeah. And Linda, what does this then tell us, which is probably what you've been trying to say to us throughout the evening about the checks and balances that needs to be put in place, especially when you're talking about savings of rural communities who are really not making a lot of money at this particular point, and they would trust this institution to say, you will look after my money, and that's why I will put it there. So what does this say about checks and balances? But to Kaya's point, what does it say about the degree of proactivity that needs to happen on those who regulate and watch over these institutions?
Thabo, I think in that regard, and really you're quite right, for me it's the people who are really concerned about what this means in real terms. But the main thing is the language even. So while we have talked about the technicalities and what's happening inside the bank, how do we communicate that out to make sure that the ecosystem, which is the depositors, the people that are in the bank, the management, the board, we are all aligned to the public interest in this aspect. This is an important bank, and we look at the trend, and it's worrying from a transformation perspective, and I must bring that in. And we need to make sure that we understand our people, and in everything that the bank is going to do, from what the curator is going to do, we've talked about how the bank needs to be open to the process so we can get the right report out to actually respond to it, but clear things that already come out in the statement from the governor, that we must get investment, that we must look at how we are strengthening the controls and the governance. But really, the management is really going to have to upskill and find a way to position itself that it's attractive not only to the investor that's going to pump this money in, but to the layman on the street who's going to continue to keep their money in this bank. So those are the checks and balances for me.
Kaya, KPMG, to many, that name might still ring a little bit of nervousness. Should they worry?
Yeah, I live in a country where KPMG is undergoing through serious challenges. They've just been fined 14 million pounds in relation to another really messed up audit of Carillion. So unfortunately, it's issues that emerged in South Africa a couple of years ago have not ended. And I think all auditing firms go through that phase where once in a while there is clearly an audit failure that they have to account for. And of course, in the South African context, a lot of people will find it a bit strange that KPMG has won the mandate in order to be able to run the curatorship, particularly because the most recent bank failure in South Africa involved KPMG being the auditors and, of course, Sipho Malaba being famous for what it did. So it would have been surprising for a lot of people. But unfortunately, as Linda mentioned earlier on, I've read and written enough about this profession to be able to tell you that with just 4 auditing firms that are of scale in South Africa, it's always a big problem to try and find someone who doesn't have any conflicts in order to be able to step up and do this type of work. So it may then well turn out that the Reserve Bank did reach out to the other firms and found that they had reasons not to undertake this particular project. And that is something that is always going to be a big problem for as long as you have, ironically, the concentration risk around the big 4. But of course, the Reserve Bank has decided that they are the ones that should be able to run with this particular institution. And of course, we hope that they do as good a job as they can. But yes, the irony is not lost on most people.
Yeah. I think, Thando, you'll also want to weigh in here. KPMG with the checkered past. I mean, this particular appointment, what does it mean in as far as the work that the Reserve Bank has done in narrowing down all the possibilities to this particular entity?
Yeah, so I want to touch further on the market concentration issue. I think it's very important that we begin to address that issue when it comes to the auditing profession itself. But I guess based on interactions we've also had, I think KPMG have done quite a lot to try and clear up their own governance processes internally. They've gone through a restructuring process where they've got a new board. So they've actually responded to some of the criticisms that were there. I mean, the issue of audit failures, is this the last one? Is this the first one? I don't think it's going to end, probably not in our lifetime, but we're going to keep getting those audit failures. And like I said, the point I made in the beginning is that it's not, I mean, we've got a profession of about 4,000 auditors in South Africa. The cases that we've had, I mean, in terms of the number of auditors who've been complicit in corporate failures, that number is very little compared to the number of auditors that we have. But that being said, I mean, it's an important profession that the auditing profession plays. So it's important that we need to minimize as much as we can the number of audit failures. One failure is actually too much if you look at the impact and the significance of those failures to the public at large. So I think KPMG has done quite a bit to clean up its house, and the Reserve Bank felt fit. They felt that it's in place, that they can appoint them to play the curator role. And I'm sure the Reserve Bank would have gone through their own checks and balances, as Linda had, and using the term that she used earlier, to make sure that they do have the competence and the independence, as well as the skill to be able to perform that function.
I appreciate you all for coming on tonight. Thank you very much. That is Linda Makoma, Kaya Sitole, and Tandoretu Mioli.